Thanks everyone for coming out tonight in the rain and all of this. So, an interesting question, which is a practitioner in user experience testing for probably about 30 years. You always get is why should we test the user experience? And there's the obvious the points here to reduce risk, identify opportunities, obviously very important, set priorities, improve the probability of success. Sort of at the bottom line. That's what we're really all, ultimately talking about. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a considerable amount of research done around the idea of what attributes contribute to the success of a software project. So if we ask the question, what objective research is there out there today that talks about what contributes to a successful project and what role user experience plays in such a project, or such projects, there's actually some very interesting data. So if we ask the larger question, how successful are projects today? And I'm sure by looking at the list of respondents, I see that we have individuals from huge companies running very large projects down to two-person startups. So if you actually look at the data here, and this is from the Standish Group, they looked at over 10,000 projects over a 8-year period. And it's kind of interesting. If you look here, this is project size, and number of team members, time, and the success rate. And as you increase in project size, there's really no magic here. Bigger projects, bigger budgets, larger teams, larger sets of product attributes and features result in less levels of success. Success defined in this particular study as on schedule, on budget, and features as promised. So you can think of the the problem that user experience research is addressing today is how do you optimize against this level of ineffectiveness? And the question would be, of course, what is the role of user experience in improving the outcomes of these types of projects on these scales? So the obvious question is, what are there factors that are actually correlated with positive project outcomes? And you can look at, this is a randomized list of variables. In fact, there's been a considerable amount of research done on this. They give this list to development teams, and they would say, okay, let's, individuals or together, collectively, give us your priority in terms of what you think on this list are the top 5 attributes that would be identified with product success. So if I ask the group here today, what do you think are the top 2? What would you say? Anybody have a guess? Okay. 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 If you ask a development team of almost any size, competent staff is first, firm basic requirements is second, proper planning is third, executive support is fourth, and ownership, who controls it, is fifth. So, it's interesting research. It's been around for a long time. And what's particularly interesting about the Standish study is that they went and looked at over these 10,000 projects. They said, okay, of those which were most successful, small to large, what were the factors that contributed most to success on these projects? And their finding was really quite different. So this is the contribution to success. It's 100 points on the vertical scale here. The criteria is obviously slightly different, but what they found in this study is that, in fact, early and continuous user involvement has the highest predictive value of long-term success in a project. Notice that these are countervailing with respect to the top 4. So you have an intuition based on how development teams think about what contributes to success versus those which we know objectively, research shows us, actually map to effective projects. So this is probably one of the most interesting and relevant pieces of research that supports why you want to test your user experience. And you can see, from the significance of user involvement here, sort of the early structure of Agile and some of the other development disciplines, which we now see are focusing on short-term, rapid iterations of high user involvement. Okay, so this final piece here, and this is one which I think as business owners, as participants in large projects, small projects, ultimately the question is, what is the business reason for doing this? And I think there's lots of research on this. The best piece, the best chart, I think, that explains this is from Bob Pressman's book. Any of you who have a degree in computer science, you'll know Bob Pressman's book on software engineering. And this is a cost of fixing the software problem versus phase of development. Design, development, post-introduction. This is one problem, and this is 10 problems. This is sort of the chart from a business point of view that defines why you want early user involvement. Because if you identify critical incidents, error states, problems, lack of a suitable feature presentation, for example, in the design phase, your business is going to be successful because you're going to have money upstream that you wouldn't have to spend fixing problems that could have been easily identified early in the development cycle. Okay, so you can sort of package all this up. I've given you a very sort of highly condensed view on what is the structure behind the business problem related to user experience testing. But at the end of the day, what you're really concerned about is the earliest identification of the most critical problems and opportunities, because user testing in its most effective form identifies opportunities as well as identifying problems. And in fact, Rob is going to talk about that. And this last part, which is critical at the least cost. A tremendous amount of usability testing, user experience testing, all of this kind of structured testing has been floating around the environment for the last 10 years. Has frankly, a lot of it has been costly, and much of it has been quite ineffective. And what we'll talk about as we go through the evening here is dominant methodologies, but also ways in which, looking at the new environment, you can reduce cost and produce very effective results. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob Tannen is a colleague I've known for a number of years. Rob is Director of Research at the Bresslergroup. You may not know the Bresslergroup. They're an industrial design firm in Philadelphia, highly regarded international firm. And Rob's expertise is qualitative research, and he is a certified ergonomics expert, specialized in complex projects. I'm not sure why he said that, because he does lots of other interesting work as well. I think we sort of met at the New York Stock Exchange. Right, we had overlapping projects there. And he's quite an active blogger. If you read Fast Company, you'll see him blogging there frequently. He has an undergraduate in cognitive science from Vassar, and has a PhD from University of Cincinnati in human factors engineering. And honored to have you here. Thank you. I'm going to switch decks. You've seen this before? Okay. Thanks for having me here tonight. Happy Leap Day. I actually learned recently that they skip a leap day every 400 years. So there's no leap day in 1700, and there won't be one in 2100. So, what that's worth. Good night. So this particular subject, essentially research methods for user experience design, is an area that's very interesting to me, not just from a professional point of view, but also from a personal point of view as well. One of the things I've been doing over the years is researching the researchers, so to speak. Who's watching the watchers, and I've written and presented and studied different methodologies, different tools that are used by researchers, what frustrations people are having as designers or researchers, and so on. And one of the things I learned early on is essentially that the tools that are available for people who are designing the tools tend to be relatively inconsistent or weak, or have been. They've improved a lot, and there's a lot of options now. And we'll present what we think some of the best ones are at this point. So at a very high level, we like to break up the world on two axes, quantitative and qualitative, and generative and evaluative.
So quantitative and qualitative should be pretty straightforward. Is the method that you're using to research or measure your design or user experience, is it numerical or is it more unstructured or subjective? And obviously nothing is that black and white, but that's sort of one gross way of measuring or dividing up the research world or the research technique world. And Charles is actually talking more on the quantitative side, and I'm going to be talking more on the qualitative side. The other axis, the generative versus evaluative, are just kind of fancy words to say, are you doing this to figure out what you're going to design, which is the generative side, or are you doing it to evaluate what you've designed? And that's the evaluative. And generally speaking, those things that are generative tend to be more qualitative, and those things that are evaluative tend to be more quantitative, which sort of makes sense. And so you kind of get this, regression towards the mean, so to speak, in these blank spots at either end. What you see here, I don't expect you to be able to read all of it, but these are the different methods we're actually going to be covering tonight, and kind of where they lay out in space as we go through them. One thing I want to stress early on, I'll probably come back to it again, is you shouldn't think of research methods as a one or the other sort of thing. Ideally, you want to pick the best set of tools or set of methods that are going to give you the right answer to the right question, and I kind of call it triangulation. Not every method is going to answer every question the same way, and so if you can pick and choose what's best and ideally pull them together, you'll kind of hone in on the question you're trying to answer. So I showed, real quickly there, a variety of different research methods, and one of the things that I thought about early on was, well, there's various methodologies and tools, but what do they have in common? What defines something as a user experience research method? And I came up with 4 categories, and no one's challenged me since then, so we'll say they're 4, but I'm open to more. And they're pretty basic. The first is document. So essentially, this would pretty much apply to any kind of research methodology. The purpose or the goal or the outcome is to capture what has happened, whether it's what the user said or what they clicked or what they looked at. You're capturing or documenting what occurred. That's kind of fundamental. The second is measure. So this goes more to the quantitative side. You're not just capturing what happened, but you're actually capturing it with respect to some known quantity. Obviously, that's what measurement is, a comparison to a known reference. And so research methods that have a quantitative aspect include not only documentation, but measurement. The last 2 are sort of more technological advancements in research tools and methodologies. So extension basically means taking the ability to do research and extending it over time and space. So a great simple example of that is the online survey. Online survey in itself doesn't do anything that you couldn't do if you went door to door and asked 1,000 people, but it makes that process a lot easier and quicker and cheaper and faster. And then the last category I call enhancement, and that's essentially methods and tools that let you do things that you couldn't do on your own. So something like eye tracking or some of the other technologies we'll talk about, like fMRI, actually allow you to measure things that you couldn't do without the technology itself. And so this is really just for background, but gives you kind of a context or a framework for thinking about the different ways you could apply research. One of the things that I wanted to stress was, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to focus more on the qualitative and Charles on the quantitative. I also tend to focus more on physical products, industrial design, typically with integrated or embedded interfaces as opposed to standalone laptops or mobile devices. But I think it's important to see why it's really a continuum and not kind of a one or the other. And Charles was nice enough to provide me with this slide. Essentially, I'm not sure how far in the future this is looking, let's say 20 years. Basically, exponential scale of what devices or systems in the world will have embedded technology. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll have interfaces, but they'll be networked, they'll have sensors, and there'll be the opportunity to design for those devices or use data from those devices to design some user experience. So, of course, we're all familiar with computer clients and handheld devices, and now we're starting to see vehicles with computers. But that's really sort of the tip of the iceberg. That's kind of the low volume stuff. Get out to machinery, home appliances. I'll talk about some appliance research I've been doing. Pallets and cases. This is something nobody really thinks about if you're not in that world, but everything that's shipping around the world is going to have embedded technology in it to tell you where it is, what temperature it is, etc. And then consumer items, which is obviously a very broad category, but it's essentially everything that's not one of those. And so there's a huge number of of products and systems that are going to have embedded technology that we're going to need to design for, and that means we're going to have to understand user interaction beyond sitting in front of a screen or holding a screen. So I'm going to go through several methods, and Charles will as well, and before we go into them, I want to kind of explain the framework we're using. We're going to describe a particular method, give it kind of its strengths and weaknesses, and then show some examples or some recommendations. So the overall framework is we'll talk about a methodology, what business problem is that methodology trying to solve, what benefits it provides, what limitations it has, kind of the pros and cons, what sort of data in terms of the format or depth is that methodology providing, what are some tools you can use to implement or execute that type of methodology, and then lastly, at a very gross level, what's the approximate cost per respondent? Is this an expensive thing per subject or respondent, or is it an inexpensive thing? And then statistical validity. And I'll get into that in a little bit about why that's relevant, or if that's relevant in some of the categories I'm talking about, which are more qualitative anyway. So the first methodology I'm going to talk about is contextual observation or ethnography. I assume most people have heard about this. It's gotten very popular over recent years. And it's essentially looking at how people are actually using products. There's a number of ways of phrasing it, but the way I like to think of it is how are people actually using products in the real world versus how are they intended to be used. And in order to achieve this veridically, it's important to observe in the context of use, in the home or the workplace or the vehicle or what have you. There's a time and a place for doing study in the lab, but typically that's not going to give you the same level of reality, especially when you're talking about things that happen off the screen. So general description is this is in-depth, in this case in-person observation of tasks and activities that are recorded. And the beauty of it, or the benefit of it, is that you have access to the full environment of the user's interactions with the system or with the task, which means they're using it with all the interruptions that they would normally have. It's got the context of the other people and the other systems that are involved, etc. It's got some limitations. The main limitation being it's very time-consuming. Essentially, you as the researcher are going to wherever you need to go to the person's environment in order to do the research. It also takes longer. If you compare going to someone's house to study them use of their appliance versus asking somebody online to answer a few questions, there's a great difference in scale and cost in doing that. Also, what you're gathering are observations, and this is a pretty important point. Unlike really all other research methods, in contextual observation, the research tool is the researcher. So you're not using some survey or scale or instrument. It's your own observational insights. And I've done a lot of training for people in this area, and it's really a challenge. You've got some people who feel they should document everything, and then they wind up with a lot of stuff to go through. And you've got other people who maybe are only interested in documenting things that are interesting or noticeable to them, and in that case, they're missing a lot. And so finding that balance is a real challenge and a real skill. So the data, basically, you've got patterns of observed behavior, what people said, what people did. You've got transcripts, and you've got video recordings. And I'll talk about a couple of tools, actually one tool that helps with that. In terms of the cost, because you have to go somewhere, because you have to spend time there, the cost is going to be relatively high, but the value is extremely high, because this is really where the rubber hits the road. This is observing people using your products when and how they should be using them or could be using them. And it's really more applicable to the beginning of a process when you want to find out what needs to improve, what needs to change, what am I missing. In terms of statistical validity, from a pure statistical point of view, you could say none, but I would sort of argue with that and say maybe it's not statistically valid. We can have, I guess, an argument about this later, but it's actually content-wise it's valid. You're actually seeing how it's being done. So you're measuring what's actually happening in some way, but perhaps you're not measuring it in the most reliable way. So a couple of quick examples. Here's somebody, this is a research project we did around an office beverage machine. You can see someone having a suboptimal experience with the interface. Here's another example. This is in an outpatient clinic. And one of the exercises I do when I train people on doing this is show them this or show them a clip of this and say, okay, document what's happening. And there's an amazing number of things happening here, so how do you understand what's worth documenting, what's not worth documenting? And typically, or not even typically, a professional did this and ended up with this. And I won't go into detail, but basically you've got kind of a time flow, a space flow, all kinds of activities. And so at the end of the day, a lot of methodologies that revolve around this kind of unstructured data and unstructured information are really about coming up with some sort of framework or technique or checklist to make sure that you are covering certain areas. And I'm not going to get into that now for time purposes, but one thing I would recommend is a tool called LiveScribe. Has anybody use this? Anybody heard of it? Okay. It's, real quick, it's a pen, records audio while you write, and so, which is great, so it's a tape recorder, big deal. But the best thing it does is while you're taking notes, it's recording. And the next day, you go back to your notes, and you're like, well, what happened when I wrote this down? You just tap on that particular line that you wrote, and it plays back the audio from when you wrote it. So it really kind of gives you an extra set of ears while you're doing research. It's also great for meetings, things like that. Okay, so that's one methodology. A variation on that is remote ethnography. Basically the same idea. You're researching people in their homes or in their environment. The difference is I'm not going there as a researcher. I'm having them self-record, either through webcams or through handheld cams, because the type of research I'm talking about is primarily around physical objects as opposed to digital devices. It's more typically handheld devices that either they self-record or have someone else in their household record. And so same sort of question or business problem is trying to solve. The difference I would say between this and the kind of traditional or in-person ethnography is that even though the in-person ethnography is in the real environment, there's some degree of artificiality in the time frame. Like if I'm going to go there, I'm going to be there for half a day, and I'm going to ask you to do all these things, and hopefully those things will make sense. But if I'm studying how people do laundry in their house, that could happen over the course of a week, and I'm not going to live there for a week, even with free laundry. So I'm going to want to, have them self-record that over time. So basically, I think I described it already, and I think the benefits are really more around longitudinal. And also, there's, of course, a cost and travel efficiency as well. So we did a study recently where instead of going from city to city, we had people in different cities self-record simultaneously. It's not real time. I'm not watching the videos as they happen. They're getting uploaded. Limitations. Well, the key thing here is because I'm not there and I don't have my observational skills present in real time, there's a lot of dependency on the skills and the articulation of the respondent. And that's something that you can try to handle through your screening process, but you're going to get some duds, just like you would with any other research method. The data, very similar to what we talked about. It's going to be videos, recordings. You can also put other sorts of measurement tools online, like checklists or surveys for people to respond to. And one tool that I'm going to talk about specifically is an online platform called Qualitative.com. And essentially, it's an online ethnographic service. And basically, you can use them to recruit people that you want to use, and they'll facilitate the whole camera mailing process and provide the framework for that. So just a couple of quick examples that I'll get to in a minute. The cost is still high, but it's significantly lower than going there yourself. And the validity is sort of the same as before. It's not valid in the quantitative sense, but it's getting you into the real context of use. So just a quick example. These are just static images, but we did a study recently looking at home appliance use, and we actually had people unload their groceries when they came home from shopping. Now, we could have kind of forced that by going to people's houses and bringing them groceries or having them shop, but this actually allowed them to shop when they wanted to shop for what they wanted to shop. And so we really got to see how they set up their refrigerators. Another nice thing about this platform is that they transcribe the videos that the people, that the participants provide. And so subsequent to that, I can actually do text searches of the video. So if I want to see, what did someone say about door handle, I can search for that and then I can jump to the video. So kind of like a LiveScribe idea again of being able to kind of more efficiently analyze unstructured data. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is qualitative data analysis. So I've talked about two different methods for gathering unstructured data. but how do you actually analyze that? That's kind of one of the big challenges in design research. I know how to analyze statistics. I know how to look at a survey and count, frequencies and get averages. How do I analyze data that's not really data? It's just words and opinions. I'm not going to explain that today because there's not enough time. But the idea is, what's the meaning of the subjective or unstructured data provided by people in these types of methodologies? And so what I'm going to do is point you to some tools that will let you not do the analysis for you, but give you some structure to what's otherwise just a bunch of text. And when I say unstructured data, this could be free text responses in a survey, it could be transcriptions from interviews, it could be any kind of open-ended text response. And sort of like I said, it provides a framework, but it doesn't do the analysis for you. And typically the way these types of tools work is by tagging or using metadata to group information into ways that are consistent across people. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. A couple of tools I'll talk about, manyeyes.com or Reframer.com. And cost is very low. These are relatively cheap tools. And statistical validity, you can use some of this data to do some more analytical research. So ManyEyes is actually a data visualization site that's funded by IBM, and it's a bunch of free, very nice data visualization tools. And one of them that people have seen is kind of the Wordle. And the idea is that you can take a bunch of text and it'll scale the size of the text to reflect the frequency of the occurrence. So this is actually, in this particular case, a word cloud or a tag cloud of people's perceptions or people's adjectives to describe a brand that they liked or didn't like. And you can see here quality stood out a lot, durable stood out a lot, etc. One of the things that's important here is not so much the tool itself, because this is not necessarily a very technical or complicated analysis, but the fact that it expresses it in a very visual way. When you're doing research, you need to think about the quality and the design of your results. That research sort of has had this. If you've ever gone to a human factors conference, had this stigma of being very dry and very boring, and then you sort of hand it to the designer and they make something nice out of it. Well, there's certainly opportunity for researchers to develop things that look nice, to communicate and get the attention of the people that they're trying to communicate with. I think a better example from an analytical point of view is a Wordtree. This is also a tool that's available on manyeyes.com. And essentially what it does is you dump your text data into it, and then you can search for any word or phrase, and it'll show you all the appearances of that word or phrase. So in this case, we were getting feedback about a home digital camera. And one of the questions was, well, what are people saying about Bluetooth? So we could type in Bluetooth, and now I get all the responses that contain Bluetooth, and I can quickly scan, what the context was to get a sense, or drill down to get a sense of what people were saying about Bluetooth. So it's providing some structure. It's not saying it's not giving you an answer about what people think about Bluetooth, but it's helping you find that answer more quickly. A more recent tool that I've been using is called Reframer. This is actually a web app that's kind of in beta. It's from a company out of Philadelphia, where I work. Not the company, but Philadelphia. And essentially, it's sort of deceptively simple. All it does is provides a web-based framework for people who are watching either a usability test or an interview or some other unstructured data collection method to share and organize their observations in a common way. So essentially, I'm watching someone doing a usability test, and I'll write down my note. Participant had difficulty locating the reset feature. I can then give a significance to that, on a 5-point scale, and I can also tag it with certain tags. So then, at the end of a study, I might have 100 comments. My colleague might have 50 comments, etc. This will aggregate them, and so, okay, what happened? What do people say about usability, or what were the highest or most severely ranked topics? So it's basically allowing you to create your own custom metadata and provide some structure to what's otherwise sort of open-ended information, and then generate reports out of it. Okay, 2 more to go through. Focus groups. Now, focus groups, I think people are probably familiar with from different avenues, from user research, from business, from marketing. And basically, the business problem a focus group is trying to solve is really more about perception versus behavior. And I think focus groups have gotten kind of a negative connotation to them, especially in the UX community, because of lack of context. There's an assumption that you're going to put people in a room, ask them a bunch of questions, and they're going to just kind of say what they feel instead of what they can actually experience. And I thought that way too, and think that way to a certain extent. Obviously, they're moderated, and you can show whatever you want in a focus group. You can show screens, you can show physical models, you can show whatever you want. They're very efficient, though, so you can get a lot of people, show a lot of people a lot of things, get a lot of information in a short period of time in person, essentially. And then, like I said, the issue being the lack of realistic context and potentially the influence of participants on each other, which is at first glance often seen as a negative, but can also be a positive, especially if you've got a product where you want to elicit group dynamics. And then the data itself can be really wide open. It could be verbatims, what people said, what people did. You could have people fill out forms and do ratings while they're doing the focus group. So it's really a mix or mashup of whatever you want to use. And tools, really, all the tools I've been talking about so far in terms of qualitative data analysis, qualitative data analysis can be applied here. Cost per respondent, more on the lower side because you're kind of doing it in bulk. And statistical validity can be from moderate to high depending upon what sort of tools you're using to gather data. I think the important thing, though, is going back to my earlier point about thinking of methods in isolation. A focus group has limitations. You recognize what those are. You can leverage it to make it more valuable. Example, you want to get feedback about a new website. You can do kind of a hybrid, which is, okay, I'm going to recruit 5 people and have them all show up at the same time. I'm going to have each of this person individually go through a moderated or unmoderated usability test on their own. Then when they're done, I'm going to bring them together to discuss it. So I get all the benefits of the individualized usability testing, but then I can get this facilitated group discussion, maybe more on the qualitative types of things after I've gotten the quantitative data. And they've just used the application, so it's fresh in their minds. So think about these as combinatorial, I guess is the word. Last category I'm going to talk about is observational ergonomics. And this is sort of a little bit different than the other categories. This is really about the physical implications of a product design. I have a background in ergonomics, and when I talk about ergonomics, people tend to think of very technical, very specialized knowledge and tools, and that's true. But I've been trying to bring that sort of technique and vocabulary to the interaction design world. I wrote a series of articles called, what did I call it? Ergonomics for Interaction Designers. And I'll talk a bit about that. But the idea is with certainly the expansion of interfaces into non-traditional types of devices, with the expansion of touch and gestural interfaces, it's really becoming essential for people who are designing interfaces to understand how the human body works and how people can interact and what's kind of good and what's bad. So the idea here is to not make you an expert in ergonomics, but give you enough information that you can understand what you're watching and get a sense of what's good and what's bad. Again, the idea of creating a framework for you to discuss something that doesn't have a lot of structure in your vocabulary already. I think we talked about that. Oh, looks like I copied. The output of these things are essentially ergonomic issues. You can think of like a checklist of ergonomic issues that you observed and the frequency that they occurred and the severity of them. You can also visualize those in interesting ways. And the tools, I'm going to just mention a couple of tools. One is RCPS, which is essentially a protocol, reach clearance, posture, and strength. Those are kind of the 4 basic ergonomic parameters. And then I'll also talk about some software tools and some technical tools as well. Cost for this stuff is actually low because it's really a knowledge base, not a tool in most parts. And statistical validity can actually be higher than some of the other qualitative methods because you're actually doing things like frequency counts and having more quantitative data. So, quick example. I'm designing an interface for an appliance. Typically, when I'm doing interface design, I'll think about things like readability, and I'll think about things like workflow and logic, but often, or traditionally, a UX designer is not going to think about ergonomics. But you can look at these things from an ergonomic point of view. In this case, This sequence of lines is the actual user's physical hand movement to do a sequence of commands. And we can look at the total number of steps, for example. We can look at the total distance that they travel. We can also look at kind of zero crossings, so we have to go back and forth. And we can actually do some comparative analysis. So here's 4 different appliances, and here's the kind of the ergonomic, almost like eye tracking, it's hand tracking, for doing a particular task. And for programming an appliance, it's probably not a big deal. But if it's something in a factory where you're going to be doing it all day, or a device where you're designing for a population that might have physical limitations, it becomes more relevant and more important. There are other very simple things you can do. There are a lot of questionnaires out there that you can use or adapt that look at things that you might not normally ask. This particular one is around tool design, but a lot of the questions in here could be adapted for handheld device design. How well does it fit your hand? Does it have a nice feeling? Does it cause blisters? Hopefully not. But those sorts of attributes can be brought into a more traditional UX framework. And then last but not least, getting kind of a little further out there are tools that you can use to actually measure ergonomic force. This is called the TPS, Tactical Pressure Sensing System. Essentially a series of force gauges that you wear on your hand, and when you're interacting with the device, you can measure duration and force on different digits. So I'll show you a real quick video. This is operating a camera. All right, maybe it won't work. But what you would get is essentially, force by time, and each one of these different color-coded lines represents a different sensor. So, index finger, ring finger, what have you, and it's a way to, again, benchmark or evaluate the ergonomic aspects of a product. So I'm going to stop there. The last thing I want to do is mention a book, which I have right here. This is not a plug because it's not my book. But it's called Universal Methods of Design, and basically it's 100 methods, kind of like the ones we're talking about tonight, with nice sort of descriptions and summaries. It's really good for someone who's new to the field and wants to get an overview of the methodologies, and for someone who's experienced, it's kind of a nice reference book as well. The woman on the front is not supposed to have eyebrows, but my 6-year-old thought she did, so that's why they're there. And now I'm going to hand it back to Charles to continue.